Welcome everybody. My name is Shaun McKinnon and I'm joined today by two of my partners, Mark Schiavello and Duncan Clubb, who I'll introduce in a moment. Today is the 7th in our banking webinar series that have been run through this COVID period. And I just wanted to reflect briefly before we get into today's session around, I guess, where we've been. So we started these at the beginning of May after we'd had about 6 weeks of COVID impact. And in that period, we've covered a number of different topics. We started off by looking at some more generic topics, and the last 3 sessions have been on specifically industries that have been impacted by COVID-19. We looked at hospitality, tourism and accommodation. Then we looked at property and construction, and this week we're looking at retail. And as we go into this webinar, we're in a bit of an interesting period right around the country. In most of the country, we're seeing people come into restrictions easing in stage 3. Unfortunately, in Melbourne, we're seeing, and in Victoria, restrictions are being tightened again. So we're in a fairly interesting period, and as we move forward to the September deadline, which a lot of people have identified as a potential cliff, given a lot of the different support measures are expected to expire. I guess we're moving into a period now where there's a bit of uncertainty as to how we're going to come out of this and the timing and what it looks like. I noticed as early as last night, I believe APRA has provided the banks further relief in relation to the ability to provide deferrals for their customers, which might extend for potentially up to another 3 to 4 months is what we're hearing. So no doubt the government will also look at potentially giving some additional support when we get to September too, so that specifically some of those most impacted industries like retail are not hit with a hammer blow when we get to September. So with that sort of overview, we'll jump into the session, but before I do, I'll just ask you, in the little chat box that you can see in your web panel that should appear on your screen, to help inform us as to how we're going to move forward with these sessions, what I'd like to do is to ask you to put any comments or thoughts or other things that you'd like us to explore as part of this banking and finance webinar series. Because we might give a little pause after this session, and based on the feedback from our banking and finance contacts, we'll then inform how we deal with this series going forward. So if you can put any comments or suggestions in the chat today, that'd be much appreciated. All right, so today's session is obviously retail industry. I'll just move forward our slides. So my name's Shaun McKinnon. I'm a partner here in Brisbane in the advisory practice. I work in the restructuring and the corporate finance space. I'm joined today by our 2 lead presenters, which is Mark Schiavello. Mark's from our Melbourne office. He's the head of our retail practice nationally. He's also a corporate finance partner. I have extensive experience in the retail industry, and Mark will be talking us through his views on how the industry is performing and where it's at and what we are likely to see once we come out of COVID. Duncan is one of my partners out of Sydney. Duncan is a restructuring partner, and Duncan, importantly, was the administrator of Harris Scarfe, so one of the larger retail voluntary administrations that have occurred in the past 12 months. And Duncan today is going to take us through a little bit of a case study as to how that unfolded, what happened in it, and what are the key learnings that you as bankers can take from that. So without any further delay, we might jump into the session. I've sort of given an overview here already as to what we're going to follow, so I'll jump straight to you, Mark, and I'll ask you to lead us off with a bit of an overview of the retail industry in your eyes.
Sure, thanks, Shaun, and good morning everyone. In retail, obviously gone through a very interesting period. In January, I was in New York City, where I attended the world's largest retail expo, the NRF Big Show, where some 50,000 delegates from all retailers around the globe meet up in New York for a 4-day trade show. And certainly coming out of that expo was certainly a sense of strong confidence among retailers. Talk about retail apocalypse and the like was not necessarily endorsed or accepted by a lot of the delegates or a lot of the participants at the expo. Indeed, there was an acknowledgement that brick and mortar retail is not dead, mediocre retail is dead. And through that conference, it became apparent that old ways of retail around opening physical stores and large store footprint expansions and just selling stock on shelves was no longer exciting the consumer. And when we unpacked what good retail looked like and what exceptional retailers were doing, it really came down to a number of themes. And the most overarching theme was really around the experience economy. Certainly in today's day and age, consumers don't necessarily think in terms of channels. They choose the most appropriate touch point and shift between them. So in terms of experience, it's both physical, it's digital, essentially it's omni. And while we've been talking omni for a long time, I think we see in a lot of the retail failures, and what Shaun and Duncan will explain later on, is a lot of the retailers that have been unable to pivot away from a brick and mortar only strategy towards more of an omni strategy have really suffered and essentially have failed and will continue to do so. But in terms of the experience economy and why brick and mortar still plays an important role within the retail experience, is the retail space, the physical retail space, allows the consumer to immerse themselves in a specific brand. Retailers that do this exceptionally well, Nike are probably the market leader in terms of how they use the physical space to allow the customer to mingle with their brand. At their Manhattan or Soho store, essentially Nike has 5 levels of an interactive space where you can try on new basketball sneakers and have a half-court game that's recorded that you can then email back to your computer. So there are just various elements that retailers are introducing into that physical space to really capture hearts and minds and essentially gain consumer loyalty. And you can see how that has really shifted from the old way of retail in having shelves, putting stock on shelves, having a store assistant and trying to sell stock. So clearly retailers in today's day and age need to do a lot more than just have a store selling stock. Also on that, in terms of that experience economy, storytelling has become an important consideration for consumers. So consumers more or less want to feel a strong connection to the brand. They want to be inspired by essentially a story. So if you're selling jeans and you just have a brand, say Jeans West, what does that brand actually mean? What does that brand stand for? With the millennials, with a new type of consumer entering the market, once again, you can't just sell product. You have to sell something that's far more inspirational or aspirational, and inspirational to really hook that consumer into your brand, drive that loyalty, and driving a reason for them either to A, enter your physical, or B, your digital store. Retailers that are doing that exceptionally well, Hermes, once a very private brand that didn't really market, are now unpacking themselves and enabling the consumer to get into the craftsmanship and the authenticity of their brand. And you can just see through storytelling. Nike's another great example whereby every store person within a Nike store has gone through a week's worth of training to understand the beginnings of that brand, what that brand stands for, and what that brand means. And those messages, that storytelling really is communicated through the store person to the consumer at every Nike store. And indeed on their digital platform, essentially you get a background into the Nike brand, what it means, what it stands for, where it's come, and where it is today. So a very essential element to hook consumers in. Moving on to other elements over the page. Yeah, sustainability is becoming, or in January at the big show, was a big theme. Consumers now are really focused about pollution. We have this conflict between consumers wanting fast fashion, i.e. when they see it on the runway, they want to see it in a Zara store within weeks. And retailers, in order to meet that demand for fast fashion, essentially it comes into conflict with another consumer priority, which that of sustainability. So fast fashion, in essence, leads to retail being one of the largest polluters globally, or one of the largest polluting industries globally, which needs to be addressed and looked into. Re-commerce was, or is currently, an answer to that problem. A business in the States called Rent the Runway essentially allows consumers via a subscription model to rent garments. So for example, if I've got a wedding in 2 weeks time or 3 weeks time, and I need to rent an Armani tux, via Rent the Runway, I'm able to do that. They deliver straight to my door. It comes in a dry clean bag. I wear the suit. I then transport the suit back to Rent the Runway. They then dry clean it themselves. So you can see how, one, that gives the consumer access to an endless wardrobe via a subscription model, while at the same time not dealing to that sustainability point where fast fashion and sustainability no longer need to be in conflict. How that business model survives COVID in terms of the consumer's the consumer's acceptance to where to essentially engage in re-commerce, I don't really know, but you can see that how that was a really nice way of, one, providing the consumer with access to all sorts of fashion at their fingertips via a subscription model, and B, dealing to the environmental need of reducing pollution. And probably another theme was around ethical sourcing. A lot of consumers now are really concerned about where their product is being produced and under what circumstances are employees producing garments. And brands now are going to extreme lengths to essentially sell their story, their narrative, to articulate exactly where they're sourcing their product from. Lush Cosmetics, in essence, deals directly with each supplier, so there's no middleman. So they know exactly what farm their product's being sourced from, under what conditions, etc. And they can then communicate that story to their consumer to then give the consumer confidence that the product that they're purchasing has been produced in a sustainable way. So this is just another example of how retail has certainly evolved. As a consumer, we no longer just walk into a store, buy a pair of jeans, buy a top, buy hand cream without understanding some of these deeper elements that really capture hearts and minds. If retailers are choosing to just put things on shelves and sell them without understanding the psychographics of what consumers are after, in essence, they're going to fail. So certainly customer first and digital first thinking is what is going to carry retailers into this new world. If I just move over to the slide, the next slide, psychographics. This was a really interesting concept whereby calm commerce is essentially a theme in the States, where when times get crazy, consumers crave calm. One unique example that was provided with an increase in shootings in the US, the number of bulletproof backpacks pack sales increased something like 3,000%. So you can see how retailers, I appreciate that's an extreme example, but you can see how retailers are leveraging fear and anxiety within consumer groups to create products that essentially solve that consumer need. So retail is very much now, it's not about selling something, it's about essentially solving problems or solving a need. And then finally, through that conference, the emotional economy, in terms of that emotional connection to a brand, is extremely important. If consumers feel they have a deep connection with a brand, it will not only foster loyalty and repeat buying, it will also foster communities in where like-minded people gather, share experience, and essentially build a community that's connected with that one retail brand. So through that conference, in terms of retail, where retail was at pre-COVID, I think three things fundamentally. One, the old way of mediocre retail is dead. Fundamentally, putting things on shelves and just selling stock is no longer a viable way of doing business. Two, omni-channel is essential to any key retail strategy, i.e. a mix of both physical and digital. Consumers don't think in terms of channels, they pick the most appropriate touch point and shift between them. And finally, sustainability is becoming more and more an important consideration for consumers, and consumers are now expecting brands to adhere to strict sustainability guidelines to give them confidence to purchase their product. So that was probably just a bit of a snapshot as to what retail looked like pre-COVID-19 from the NRF Big Show in New York.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. So I'm now going to throw over to Duncan, who will take us through a case study of the Harris Scarfe voluntary administration.
Excuse me. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Shaun. So today I've just been asked to I guess, run everybody through the Harris Scarfe voluntary administration. A really interesting and almost textbook case of how to restructure a business through the voluntary administration process. Harris Scarfe, for those who aren't aware, is a very old and very established Australian retailer. The business began over 170 years ago, but predominantly in the southern states. So when I became the administrator, I found that people from New South Wales and Queensland, if they were aware, they weren't particularly aware of what the business was or did. But once you go into the southern states, South Australia, Adelaide, Tasmania, there was a very high degree of awareness as to what Harris Scarfe did. And it was held in same sort of regard as a David Jones or a Myer, so a large sort of multiple product retailer, everything from cutlery through to footwear. So it was a business that's had a long history. It's been through the administration process once already in 2001, and following its 2001 administration, it's been owned by a succession of private equity firms. Private equity, being private equity, have used the subsequent 18 years to grow the business very aggressively. So the store footprint went from 38 stores in 2001 up to 66 stores in just before Christmas, when the business failed again. And you know, by virtue of that expansion, they've gone to areas outside of, I guess, where the brand had real resonance, into New South Wales, into Queensland, into Perth. And that large store network, coupled with the underperformance of the majority of those new stores, was really a major driver for failure of the business. The business was just, the networks of the 66 stores, about 40 were profitable on a standalone basis. So a large proportion of them were loss-making. And that really crimped the business's ability to adapt and change in the way that Mark has just sort of spoken to. It didn't have the working capital to be able to restructure and reimagine itself as a retailer of the future. So if we move on to the next slide. So in December 2012, early December, there was a transaction which saw the owner of the Harris Scarfe Group sell the business to a company called Australian Retail Holdco, which is an entity set up by another private equity firm, being Allegro. The reason for the sale was interesting. It was formerly owned, the business was formerly owned by a company called Greenlit, which was formerly known as Steinhoff. So if you might recall, a few years ago, Steinhoff had a major accounting fraud, billions of dollars. Steinhoff is a large South African-based retailer, global retailer, and it had a major accounting fraud, billions of dollars lost. And as part of that process, they've been realising businesses elsewhere in the globe that they regard as non-core, with a view to sort of rectify the balance sheet of Steinhoff, now called Greenlit. They had several attempts at selling Harris Scarfe on a standalone basis, but that was unsuccessful. Harris Scarfe, as I said, was loss-making. It was regarded as a bit of a dinosaur in terms of its retail model, and there wasn't a lot of appetite for it on a standalone basis. So what Greenlit did was they basically said it sold it as a package deal. So they sold it together with several other businesses, being Postie, a New Zealand-based retailer, and for those here in Australia, Best and Less, so a very well-known Australian retailer. So it was sort of a three package job lot, and as part of the job lot, if you wanted Postie and Best and Less, which were good performing businesses, you needed to get Harris Scarfe. So the business was bought in December, early December, and the new board embarked on a very rapid turnaround plan, restructuring plan. They engaged immediately with their landlords to try and work through a way of restructuring the business. But the conclusion of that after a week was that it was going to cost somewhere between $90 and $95 million to solvently restructure the Harris Scarfe Group and take it down to a business model whereby all stores were profitable, all stores were profit generating. There was not the appetite from the shareholder who had just acquired it as part of the group deal, or from the debt provider, which was a related entity, to provide that $95 million. So at that point, the directors had no real option but to appoint administrators. So that's, I guess, a bit of the background to failure. And the key thing there being to solvently restructure this business was going to cost somewhere between $90 and $95 million. And that's basically to work through, of that $95 million, $50 million was to deal with non-performing store, the rent on non-performing stores. So to break those leases and make good was about $50 million. There was about a $20 million working capital requirement for the business. And there was $20 million for a repayment of secured debt, which was falling due in March this year. So that is, I guess, some of the background. Was there still value in the business? Well, as I said, the brand is very well known in the southern states. And at its core, there was a store group of around 40 stores which were profitable, positive EBITDA, positive profit after tax. But the challenge was really realizing and getting access to those profitable stores in a way that made commercial sense. So I've touched on that. I guess when I said it was a unique and fairly unusual or perfect example of a restructure via VA, the shareholding was acquired for a very nominal sum by one entity. The secured debt was acquired by another PE-related entity at face value, essentially. So they had control, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So once they elected not to provide further funding, and the board had no choice but to put the company into administration, or they felt the responsible thing to do was put the company into administration, the shareholder / debt provider could control that vote in the administration's process, but I'll touch on that later. The unusual thing, again, I guess, was that this happened pre-Christmas. Typically, we find with retail administrations, it happens post-Christmas because the ownership group want to have the benefit of that Christmas trading period. In this instance, the board chose to appoint us on the 11th of December. So it all happened very quickly, and the creditor group then had the benefit of that pre-Christmas trade. So we got appointed to, if you just go back a slide, Shaun, to that group structure. No, okay, never mind. So we got appointed to about 8 entities. Sorry. Yeah, this one here. So we got appointed all the entities in red. The main operating entities were DS Opco and Harris Scarfe Financial Services. So once we were appointed as administrator over those 8 entities, receivers were appointed to the 2 entities outlined in orange, which are the trading entities. So we didn't deal with the ongoing trade of the business through Christmas, but we dealt with the restructure through a deed and docker post-Christmas. The trading was very successful through the Christmas period. I mean, the business became massively cash positive, as you would expect for a retail business in the lead up to Christmas. But the good thing was that cash was available for creditors as a whole, which is not normally the case if you do a post-appointment administration. So if we jump on to slide 13, Shaun, I'll just sort of talk through how the VA played out. Okay, yep, that's the one. Thank you, mate. When it was in VA, it became quickly apparent that this wasn't a loan-to-own scenario. A loan-to-own scenario being where the vendor, well, the owner gets it back in a restructured form. The private equity firm made it abundantly clear that they were not interested in owning Harris Scarfe at the end of the administration process. They were focusing their attention on the other businesses, being Postie and Best and Less, and that they were quite happy to see Harris Scarfe go to a new owner altogether. Now, normally when you do a retail sale, security of tenure is an important aspect for the incoming purchaser. And so you would usually do a business like this through a deed of company arrangement, because those lease contracts continue on and give the purchaser security of tenure for those stores. You don't have to worry about assigning them. You don't have to worry about new contracts. It's just a very smooth process, and that's typically the driver for a docker of a retail business. The store portfolio was quickly right-sized, so we went from 66 down to 43, and that was done at the end of January. So once the bulk of that Christmas and Boxing Day sale trade had been done and the stock had been worked down, the store portfolio was right-sized to 43. 43 was a number whereby all the stores were profitable on a standalone basis. Through that process, there was some fairly solid negotiation with the landlords. And of those 43, the stores were either already profitable in their own right, or in working with the landlords came to the party and reduced their rent so that their store remained profitable and was therefore included in the sale process. As you could appreciate, it's not really the climate where landlords want empty space. So there was a closure of around 23, 24 stores. Those ones were either not profitable and were never going to be profitable, or the landlords were unwilling to accept the necessary rent reductions to make the store profitable. So those stores were closed. The staff were made redundant, and that was sort of the end of those stores. But the core business, which remained, right-sized down to 43, the workforce was reduced by about 600 people, down to around 2,400 staff, and the sales process carried on. The challenging thing here was that COVID kicked in at around about the time that the sales process was really ramping up. So it had to be accelerated because the sales were just dropping by the day over that March period, as you may recall, and that was when the sales transaction was really getting close to completion. So fortunately, we managed to lock the buyer in. They confirmed that they wanted to do it through a deed of company arrangement. And they were committed at that point, which was really very lucky from a business perspective, because retail sales just continued to get worse and worse, obviously. So that was, I guess, how the sale planned out. The interesting thing, that post locking them in, the behaviour of the purchaser changed. So it was sold to the Spotlight Group, who are a very large and very well-known retail organisation. They've got strong bargaining power with landlords at the best of times, but they really back themselves in this sales process to get a strong outcome with their landlords. And how they did that was that they changed one of the terms of the sale process, which was that we had to disclaim all the leases at the finalisation of the docker. So before they took full control, we had to disclaim all the leases. So they basically backed themselves to go month to month on 43 stores. Taking away their security of tenure that you would normally want when you're buying a business, and leverage the uncertainty and the fact that they're not committed to anything with the landlords to get a really good outcome. And so the landlords were basically jammed. They were stuck. They had no choice but to go with it. And of those 43 stores, I think they got an on average rent reduction of around 23% across the whole portfolio. So that was a really interesting change in behaviour, and I think reflective of what we're going to see in terms of negotiations with landlords going forward. The key stakeholders in the Harris Scarfe group, obviously landlords. There was a sort of a split between those 43 who stayed on with an ongoing tenant and those who were disclaimed. The return to landlords in this process was around 4 cents in the dollar on that unsecured component. So be it the rent that they were entitled to under their rent but agreed to reduce, or the rent for the store that was totally disclaimed and abandoned. So 4 cents in the dollar on that number, which I said earlier, to restructure it in a solvent way was going to be $55 million. So there was a big change there. So a lot of the cost of restructuring this group was borne by the landlords, as those leases sort of no longer binding on the group. The majority of employees were retained and just transferred across to the new entity. Their employee entitlements were paid in full from the trading of the business over the Christmas period. So there was no real pain felt at the employee level. The secured debt provider got out in full. So that was $70 million that they got repaid. And that was a very strong outcome for them in a retail situation like this. Of that 70 million, there was about 20 million which directly related to Harris Scarfe, and there was around 50 million which related to cross guarantees. So of the 50, there's probably another 20 subordinated into Harris Scarfe, and then there was a cross guarantee across the other parts of the group, so Harris, Best and Less, and Postie. So the secure debt provider got a really strong outcome out of this process, paid in full, and and of that payment in full, some of the debt actually belonged to Best and Less, so they've actually improved the performance of their whole portfolio. Suppliers got a cents in the dollar return. It's still being calculated, but it's going to be somewhere between sort of 10 and 20 cents in the dollar. Interesting in talking to the suppliers, they were really concerned with a couple of things. One, they didn't want the private equity owner to get the business back. They felt that they had been materially prejudiced by the actions of the private equity party not supporting the business and forcing the directors to put it into administration. So there was a real bit of bad blood there. They didn't want the private equity guys to continue trading with Harris Scarfe. So that was their first concern. Their second concern was that they wanted an ongoing customer. So when we could say to them, yes, it's a write-off for you guys in the near term. You'll get somewhere between 10 and 20 cents, but there will be 44 stores that are going to continue to trade, and they're going to be viable because of these rent reductions. That was a major factor for them in deciding to support the sale process, because they're concerned about ongoing viability of their own businesses, and they want to have that customer base. And as I said, Harris Scarfe is a large vendor in the southern states of the country. So on the, I guess, final outcomes and reflections from the whole thing, as I said at the outset, this was a very strong and almost textbook example of how to restructure a business through a formal process. The majority of the pain was felt by the landlords as non-profitable stores and long-term leases were exited. Some of the landlords had claims of up to $30 million in their own right for leases that had been breached. The ongoing business has been right-sized. It's profitable on a standalone basis, and it's got an ongoing relationship with the majority of its suppliers. And I guess the most interesting thing from my perspective was how quickly the purchaser changed their attitude and their approach to really take advantage of the uncertainty created by the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm happy to take any questions if anyone's got any specific ones they want to pop in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll push on with the next part of the session.
Thanks, Duncan. So the next thing we're going to walk through here is I'm going to take you through a bit of a look at some of the 2020 retail insolvencies that we've seen. We're also going to have a look at them in the context of COVID-19, and there's 5 that we're going to look at this stage. Tiger Lily, G-Star, Colette, Jeans West, and the Paz Group. And what I'm going to take you through is a little bit of an overview of the background to each of them, what were the causes of failure, and then having a look at what the outcome is likely to be, and see what common themes are emerging from these insolvencies. So look, in terms of background, so Jeans West, a pretty well-known brand. Since 1972, they've been around, but they were acquired by their current owners as late as 2017. They were trade owners rather than a private equity group. There was 145 stores, 2 distribution centres here in Australia, and 1,000 staff. An administrator was appointed on 15 January, so just after that post-Christmas trading period that Duncan had talked about. The VAs continued to trade the business while they sought a sale, which is a common theme. And during the sale process, they were renegotiating leases to be able to restructure the business. From Colette, we saw that had been around since 2010. They're a handbag and accessories chain. It was 51% owned by the original founder and then 49% owned by IFM Investors, which is a private equity arm of an investment arm of a private equity group. There is 140 stores and 300 staff in that group at the date of appointment. They were appointed as administrators on the 4th of February, which was just as COVID was starting to come into play. Again, the voluntary administrator continued trading those stores, but what was interesting about this, and it was the first of a number of COVID impacted retailers where they went to court and obtained orders which effectively gave them the ability to avoid personal liability for some of the debts of the business, primarily allowing them to use the leased premises without having to pay for them for a period of time. The next one we're going to look at is Tiger Lily. That was a women's clothing apparel store. There were 30 stores in the group, but they had actually been going through a restructure pre-COVID, so some stores had already been closed. They had been acquired in 2017 by Crescent Capital Partners, which is another private equity group. And as I mentioned, they'd gone through a restructure pre-COVID, but the onset of COVID basically was the straw that broke the camel's back, and they appointed administrators on the 22nd of March. Now, G-Star is a bit more recent. They are another apparel brand. They have 57 stores across Australia, 200 staff. The landlords were primarily the major creditors. Interestingly, for this one, there was actually no secured debt. It had also been the second time that G-Star had been in voluntary administration over the past 5 years. The voluntary administrator was appointed on the 15th of May. They have continued to trade that business while they've been renegotiating leases. They also went to court to obtain an application around reduction of personal liability to effectively allow those leases to be operated without having to pay for them for a period longer than which the Corporations Act typically provides an administrator. And the final one I wanted to touch on was the PAS Group. Again, another apparel group. This is a publicly listed company, although 65% of the share capital is owned by a private equity group. There are 225 stores in the group and 1,300 staff. They do primarily retail sales plus some white label manufacturing for other retailers. They had also been trying to restructure pre-COVID and eventually appointed an administrator on the 28th of May. Now that administrator is continuing to trade the business. But what's really interesting about PAS Group is that the board actually came out and stated that they actually believed the company was still solvent, but that they felt that the challenges of COVID-19 required a restructure via an administration. The voluntary administrators are looking to restructure that business and are currently looking at a sale process. A couple of little things that I wanted to comment on, which was the nature of the sale process that are run in these. Now, in relation to Jeans West, they ran a sale process that started on the 18th of January and called for expressions of interest by the 31st of January. And Tiger Lily ran a sale campaign that commenced on the 26th of March and asked for an expression of interest to be made by the 3rd of April. So these are really tight timeframes in which people are being able to respond. And what that tells us, I think, is that while an administrator is bound to seek the best opportunity for any business that they're administrator of, and that includes looking to sell it to an external party, is that the overriding concept or the overriding strategy behind these VAs was to restructure the business, and in most cases so that existing owners or people that had existing stakes in the business could restructure it and continue it on the way forward. Now, I just want to touch briefly on the causes of failure that were highlighted, and there'll be no surprises here. Jeans West were talking about the fact that competition had caused declining store sales, and they had a poor product mix. They cited the lack of online presence and the investment in that as one of their key issues, and overheads were just too high. Colette identified the weak retail environment and a failure to secure a new funding deal. Tiger Lily also identified the retail environment. Because of the timing of this administration, they also cited that it was COVID-19 that drove them into this position. And again, withdrawal of financial support from their primary funder, which in this case was the private equity owner. G-Star identified the impact of COVID-19 as the primary reason for going into administration. And the PAS group identified the wider retail challenges, the lack of differentiation in an e-commerce platform and investment in same, and then obviously COVID-19 as well. So look, I think the common theme through all of these is that retail environment leading into this was causing stress on these businesses. They identified COVID-19 in many cases as effectively the straw that broke the camel's back. But I think it's arguable too that what actually occurred in some of those was that the owners of these saw it as a good opportunity to be able to restructure the business and use the VA tool and process to be able to actually get a positive outcome that could see the business survive on the other side of this. And now what's the outcome? Now, some of these are still ongoing, so I'll talk to you where they're at as far as we can say. So Jeans West, they saw 39 stores closed by the administrator, leaving, and circa 230 staff unfortunately had to be let go. They made a sale to a related party. It was actually one of the existing equity holders. They had 680 staff that did retain their jobs, and the sale that was made was actually conditional on the renegotiation of certain leases. Importantly though, that business has survived, and what we've seen obviously is going forward it will be restructured with a smaller footprint. It'll have a smaller overhead base, and no doubt similar to what Duncan said happened in Harris Scarfe, is that these businesses, these stores that remain will be the profitable ones. Now, Colette, that's still in progress, but they have closed a number of stores already. Tiger Lily, they actually closed all their stores post-appointment, but only due to COVID-19. In that outcome, the private equity group actually bought out the bank security. There was one of the big four banks actually had some working capital finance in there. So the private equity group bought that out so that they could control the process. There was a sale process conducted by the administrator and there were offers received, but interestingly, as the secured party were being required to release their security to affect the sale, the private equity owners actually rejected those offers and in fact put forward a DOCA proposal, which was ultimately determined to give a better outcome to the creditors. That DOCA proposal, interestingly, pooled a lot of the creditors. So it provided for the business to go forward in a slightly different form, but it identified certain creditors which obviously would have been relevant to their go forward importance to the business and paid them different amounts. So Pool A, for example, might have got 100 cents in the dollar, Pool B might have got something slightly less, Pool C, less again. And then there were some creditors that didn't get anything at all, and those creditors were creditors that wouldn't have received anything in a liquidation anyway. So a really good example of restructuring a business using the flexibility that comes with the deed of company arrangement process to be able to structure a deal that will be palatable to creditors, that creditors will vote for, to be able to actually agree a way forward, and which allows the business to survive. G-Star is pretty new. That sale process is currently being conducted, but all reports are that it is likely to be restructured so that the business can survive. And PAS Group equally is working through its restructuring options. The administrators have cited the fact that they're most likely going to restructure the business while they're seeking sale offers, which are currently being sought. So what are the common themes that we've seen in these? Most importantly, all businesses are surviving at this stage at least. So the VA process is being used as a really effective tool to restructure and ensure survival for these retail businesses. None of these retail businesses have much in the way of assets other than brand, P&E and stock. So really it is a situation where primarily there's not a major presence of a secured lender Usually it's just some working capital finance, and it's the equity holders that are really driving the process. There is a cost though for each business that is restructured, and those that are wearing the cost are typically landlords who are losing tenants or having to reduce their lease rentals, and in some cases having extended periods while the VA process is going through its motions where they're not getting rent paid. The employees, we've seen a lot of employees obviously suffer job losses, and unsecured creditors, there have been many that have been left unpaid or receiving only a portion of their debts. One of the key themes though is that the core brands of all these businesses are still valuable. Business models though had become out of date. They were top heavy with overheads, long-term leases that maybe had been signed in a different environment, and there was a lack of online presence investment. And the equity holders have largely been able to extract value and or retain their equity position without having to bring in external capital through this process. So that's all I wanted to talk on there. I might just flick over now back to you, Mark, to sort of take us through where you see things are going to go going forward.
Well, thanks, Shaun. Yeah, I think there's going to be, moving forward, mediocre retail is dead. I think that will be evident once the benevolence ends. So once JobKeeper, government stimulus and other forms of funding discontinue, I think you'll see an increasing number of retail restructures. There is clearly an acknowledgement, and in the example that Shaun has provided, that large retail footprints are no longer the way retailers need to do business. Very much retailers are now looking towards smaller physical footprints through flagship stores, and flagship stores really drive that experience. Pop-up stores which allow them to hit target areas at specific times for specific promotions, and then also an online channel with digital-led or digital-first thinking. So with a lot of brands that are in the market that have brand presence and have some value, the only way they're going to be able to undo the mess of large store rollouts is through the restructures that Shaun has articulated. And I think you'll see, we've seen with Kiki K, classic example of a business whose store footprint was just too big. Brand still strong. That business has been purchased out of administration, and I think in a new world will thrive because of the brand and the new strategy around flagships, digital first, and pop-ups, that business will thrive. So digital first thinking is the new normal. Obviously, with a lot of traditional retailers with brick and mortar only stores, I think they're going to die or need to sell their brand. The reason why I say that, it's too late to pivot from a physical only strategy to an omni strategy at this point in time. I feel if you don't have that mix or that blend of physical and digital, it will really be challenging for you beyond this COVID period. Consumers now will want to probably deal more with digital platforms because there'll be some trepidation around going out and mingling prior to a vaccine or some form of COVID cure. So digital first will be important in this new normal. As I've said, flagship stores and pop-up stores, that will be the new way of physical footprints as opposed to historical store rollouts. Now, in terms of landlords and what that means for them, I'd like to think that retailers will look at shrinking their footprints, which will probably have some flow-on effects for landlords. And then finally, for retailers, shoring up your supply chain. With a lot of the world locked down and retailers sourcing stock from various parts of the world, That is going to be a very challenging process for them as they look to restart out of this COVID period. So having alternative suppliers, ensuring at that supply chain to ensure when you do reopen and when things do return to normal, that you have stock, the appropriate stock on shelves that your consumers are after. Fundamentally, that is going to be very important. But in terms of the retail outlook, I still feel strong brands will prosper through this post-COVID period. The business models will pivot away from physical only to digital first, flagships, pop-ups, and all of those things and those themes that I spoke of earlier will still be highly relevant in terms of the experience economy, sustainability, and psychographics, i.e. that emotion, connecting the consumer with your brand in an emotional capacity. All those things will be highly relevant for retail moving forward.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. So what we might now just quickly, briefly touch on is what you as bankers should be looking for in your portfolio, I guess, as we come through to the September period and we move forward out of COVID-19. Just a couple of things that hopefully you've picked up from this already. Obviously, retailers with large store footprints, retailers with lazy or confused strategies, or worse, no strategy at all. And most importantly, probably retailers that have got tired in-store experiences and are tied to long lease terms. Retailers that have got undeveloped or no online strategy are also those that we're seeing are at risk. And the question obviously is coming up time and time again for us, which is retail actually a property problem? Is it the focus is on commercial property owners that have a high proportion of retail tenants is probably the issue for banks at the moment. And what's the status of those tenants during the COVID-19 recovery period? So I guess that's really the theme, is that retail's under pressure, everybody's aware of that. The reasons for it are varied, but it ultimately relies around some of these points that Mark has raised and that Duncan identified and that we saw in some of these 2020 insolvencies, which is these points we've got up here on the screen around the strategy and the sort of over-bloated store structures. And most importantly, that we're going to see the VA process used by a number of retailers going forward. And I think this will only become more and more prevalent when we move through the period of COVID-19 and we start to see a recovery. Retailers are going to be in a position where they need to be able to restructure to survive. And the voluntary administration process is actually a very effective way to do that, which we've seen retailers are already taking advantage of. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Obviously, just as a brief recap, we talked about where the industry was pre-COVID, and Mark gave us some really good insights around that. In particular, what a good retailer looks like. We've given a bit of a case study around the Harris Scarfe administration. We've had a high-level overview of some of the recent insolvencies, and then Mark's given us his view of where the market's going to go going forward, and in particular, what good retail looks like. So look, I'll just give a moment there to see if there's any questions. I haven't had any come through, but if you wanted to type anything into the questions panel, I'll give you a moment or so to do that. Doesn't look like we've got any coming through at this stage. Hopefully we've answered all your questions already. All right. Look, in the absence of any questions, I'll wrap that up. Again, thank you for everyone that attended. If you wanted to provide any feedback around things that we could look at going forward or any other presentations that you might be interested in, we'd be happy to hear those. Thank you to Duncan and for Mark for joining us today, and for everybody else. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day.